Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the European Resource Adequacy Assessment 2022. We are very happy today to present you the preliminary input data package for this year's ERA edition. And at the same time, we take this opportunity to launch a call for evidence where we would like to ask your feedback on this preliminary data package. So in this webinar, we are going to give you an overview of the main insights of this data package. We'll start with an introduction first of the European Resource Adequacy Assessment 2022, so the main assumptions and the background of this study. Then, since this webinar is focusing on input data and assumptions, we'll also give you an overview of how the data collection process works at ENTSO-E. In order for you to understand also the complexity of this process and how we treat the data collection. Before we move on to the insights and the main figures of this data package that we are also publishing today. And then we'll also have the opportunity to have some comparisons with previous years' data package, but also some the EU scenarios for the Fit for 55 package. Finally, we'll conclude our webinar and we'll present you also the next steps with respect to stakeholder interaction, so our next events, and where you can also what you can also expect in the near future with respect to our methodological insights and also our further assumptions on the economic viability assessment. So I will now give the floor to Christoph Slers, who is going to give a brief overview and introduction of the ERA 2022.
Thank you, Lazarus, and good morning, everyone. So by now, I presume that most of you know the general context of ERA. So I will go quite quickly over this slide without going into the details. However, I think it remains important to mention that, as is defined in the ERA methodology, the implementation of this European Resource Adequacy Assessment still comes with a trajectory that should be fully completed and implemented as of ERA 2024. But now for ERA 2022, of course, we at ENTSO-E, we want to again take an important step forward, both on methodology, which is part of a next webinar that will be organized in the weeks to come, but also on the side of stakeholder interactions. And that's one of the reasons of why we are together now in this webinar and why we will launch the public consultation on input hypothesis for ERA today. Next slide, please. So on the main assumptions, very high level. First, an overview of the key hypotheses, the key parameters that need to be defined as an input of any adequacy assessment, basically. And of course, the first and maybe even most important part is on renewable energy sources, storage, load trajectories in each member state, which is of course a key assumption, a key hypothesis for this kind of assessments. As was the case in the previous years, this data is basically first and foremost based on the national energy and climate plans submitted by the member states and communicated through the TSOs. So this is nothing new. Of course, as we all know, we recently had this renewed European Fit for 55 ambitions. We of course also all know the recent evolution on more geopolitical level, which of course might and will have an impact on these input parameters for the different member states. And this is therefore also one of the key important things of launching this stakeholder consultation. We want to give insight into the input data that was provided at the end of last year for the different member states, and we really want to invite all of you to reflect on these assumptions, also in the light of these renewed ambitions, Fit for 55, and the recent evolutions more on the geopolitical level, and give the opportunity Of course, in the first place to member states to review the assumptions, but of course also open the floor to other parties and invite them also to share their insights on these assumptions. Secondly, on climate, which is again also an important input parameter for the adequacy assessments, but there we are working on towards, let's say, the future solution of having a forward-looking climate database together with Copernicus C3S project at European level. But for this era, the situation remains stable compared to last era, where we will still use a detrended version of the existing historical climate database for the analysis. And then last but not least, on interconnection, there methodologically, that will be part of one of the next public webinars, we will also take a step forward where we will implement flow-based market coupling, at least in essential scenarios and at least for the core region. But we're also working on extending this to other regions. And of course, for the regions where there will not be a flow-based market coupling, there will still be the classical net transfer capacity modeling of interconnected capacity. Next slide, please. Then on the timeline of the ERA itself, but also of this public consultation. So today, with this webinar, we will open, let's say, a window, a feedback window for stakeholder feedback on this preliminary data publication that will be published also today on our website. And it will be opened until the 5th of April. We call this a call for evidence. This is why did we use this term? Of course, time is short. We now open the floor for some feedback, but of course, in parallel, we also already need to prepare the models, the simulations, and we're really short on time. So it's really important also with this feedback that we ask from all of you to be as precise, as evidence-backed as possible to make sure that we can, as much as possible, directly integrate this feedback into the hypothesis. And that's also why I mentioned that, of course, the feedback of member states themselves, and this can possibly go through their TSOs, of course, is of course key as this per country input data on load, on rest, on storage, on demand response. This is of course really key. And it, of course, remains a responsibility and a prerogative of these member states to determine the ambitions related to their country for the years to come. So as said, so this window will remain open until the 5th of April, where we await your feedbacks. We will then analyze the feedback and to a maximum extent possible take this into account for the next steps in this era. On the slide, you can also see, let's say, the overall high-level process for the ERA with the intended publication by November of this year. Then I think I'll give the floor to my colleague Lazaros to take as a step forward a bit deeper into the data collection information. Lazaros?
Thanks a lot, Christoph. I also forgot to mention at the beginning of the webinar that you can post, of course, your questions in the chat box below. And after it's part of this webinar, we can, depending on the time, we can also answer your questions, while at the same time, some colleagues will also answer your questions in the chat when this is feasible. So after this introduction by Christoph, I would like to give a first overview on the data collection process at ENTSO-E. So the data collection process consists of basically 4 steps, the ones that you can see in the slide here. We start by building the scenario storyline, so what kind of data we want to gather. This was mainly at a high level described by Christoph before, so compliance with NECPs, also net transfer capacities, what kind of data we want. And in order to do that, we have a dedicated team at ENTSO-E, which actually prepares the templates that will be used for this purpose, and also detailed guidelines, because it's very important that we make sure all TSOs that provide the data understand in the same way and interpret in the same way the data that we are asking to collect. So we have the templates, we have the guidelines, which we also publish usually at the end of the process. We did for ERAA 2021. And then finally, we launch the data collection with the correspondence of the TSOs. That's the first step of the data collection. And then, of course, the weight is moved to TSO correspondents, who start submitting their data and their projections. And at the same time, we at ENTSO-E prepare some internal webinars in which we allow TSOs to interact between each other, coordinate, and also have Q&A sessions with them in order to better understand what is requested in this data collection and to better align the data that are provided by TSOs. Of course, these projections of TSOs should always be coordinated with the member states, and our main goal is to have the most up-to-date information, up-to-date information at the moment of the data collection, and make sure that there are no, for example, no updates in the member state decisions that are not included. Of course, there should be a specific deadline for that in order to make sure that we ensure that we publish on time. But apart from that, we try to be as much as possible up to date. This is the second step of the data collection, with submission deadline of the data from the TSOs. And after this period is finished, we start at ENTSO-E with some automated sanity checks. So this part is basically to identify minor mistakes in the submission of the files, in the Excel files that we gather. It can also be some figures that are provided in the wrong way due to a misunderstanding in the way that the data should be provided. So these are automatic checks. And then we have iterations, of course, with the TSO correspondence in order to fix those and update the input data, so correct the input data. Then we do also some data visualization, which in most cases it helps a lot in identifying any inconsistencies or any mistakes in the data. And this part of the data checks finishes with some test models, which can highlight, when we start building our models, our test models, we can find mistakes or even infeasibilities caused by some specific input data. So in those cases, again, we go back to TSOs, we coordinate with them, we update the data until we have a first version of the data set that all the minor errors or potential infeasibilities are solved. So that's the automatic part where we check for errors using our models and tools. And then we have the last part of this data quality process, which is basically to qualitatively assess the data. So we have set up a specific team for that, a task force, to qualitatively assess and critically assess the input data that we gathered. And based on this assessment, this task force also coordinates with TSOs, interacts with the correspondents in order to fix in case that we find some errors, to fix those errors and finalize the data set. So this is currently at the time of this webinar, this is work in progress. And another step towards ensuring the quality of the data set is actually the current call for evidence. So this is also part of what we name a data quality assessment. We want your feedback, we want stakeholders' feedback, and in case we from this feedback we see that there are things that need to be updated, and we have the time to do that, this will be incorporated in the data in the final data package. So this is a very important, of course, part of the process because it leads to the final data package that will be used for the simulations. This is the overall data collection process at ENTSO-E. And then I would like to also give you an overview of the data structure. So what is the data set that we published now, and the data set that we ask for your feedback, but also but also another part of the data package that is not included, and it will be discussed in a future event. So first of all, their assumptions consist of 5 main blocks. The first block you see here is the Pan-European Climate Database. So these are the climate data that we use in our models in order to calculate the hourly generation profiles, for example, of hydro, solar, and wind. Then we have the Pan-European Market Modeling Database. This is the database that includes all data like generation capacities, storage resources, demand side response, reserve requirements, and demand figures. We have the network block, which includes the net transfer capacities, but also the connect list and the input data for calculating the flow-based domains for the regions that we will implement a flow-based assessment. And finally, we have the economic parameters which are used in our models. An example here is the carbon and fuel prices. But also we have the economic data that are relevant and the data that are relevant to the economic viability assessment, which which might include, for example, the investment candidates or assumptions on mothballing and demothballing. This last part is not under the context of this workshop. It will be discussed in our next webinar on the 17th of March. But in this call for evidence and this webinar, we are focusing only on the three first blocks, which are the data that we gather from TSOs, and they are before we implement any economic viability assessment. You can see also here the color code. It might be interesting for you to know which of these data are actually calculated data and which data are calculated centrally and which data are delivered by TSOs as such. So the PCD, first of all, is a data package that is delivered by an external expert on climate, and based on this and the assumptions of the Pan-European Market Modeling Database, we generate the hourly profiles for the generation. So the generation profiles are calculated, but the climate data are provided by our external expert. The Pan-European Market Modeling Database is mostly delivered by TSOs. So it's estimations and projections by TSOs, which are then, for some cases, like for example, the demand profiles, we use a central tool where, based on the demand figures submitted by TSOs, we calculate the detailed hourly demand time series using a specific modeling and forecasting tool at ENTSO-E. Finally, NTCs and flow-based related data. These are coordinated. Between TSOs, and they are delivered through this data collection process. At this point, I mean, I gave you an overview of the data collection process and the data structure, and we can continue our webinar with the main insights on the ERAA 2022 preliminary data. But maybe before we go to that, I need to see whether we have some questions.
Yeah, I think indeed we have some questions. I think I can take the first two questions. So the first one was on On the NECPs and the fact that indeed most of them were created before the Fit for 55 targets were even published. So indeed, it's obvious that they're certainly not all Fit for 55 compliant. And again, that's also one of the reasons why we want to provide some insights today in this webinar on this. Now, the TSOs were, of course, when delivering the data, in contact with their member states in order to make sure, to the maximum extent possible, that the provided data is as close as possible to the ambitions, the most recent national ambitions of the member states. In the end, of course, it remains their responsibility of those member states to send in the most actual hypothesis also to this ERA assessment, and to make sure that to the maximum extent they are in line with the ambitions of Fit for 55. And then the second question is on capacity remuneration mechanisms. How do we intend to, how do we coordinate with TSOs to make sure that the projections are, let's say, homogeneous, so in line or not with potential capacity remuneration mechanisms that are in place? Now here, I think it's worth mentioning that what we're talking about here is the raw input data provided by TSOs, and which indeed also includes, for example, thermal capacities, but which indeed creates a picture of this thermal capacities as the first input hypothesis, input assumptions, and which will all be part of the analysis that will take place centrally at ENTSO-E, including scenarios, central scenarios with capacity mechanisms that are already in place. And there, at the central level in the scenarios, we will ensure that for these countries where these are already in place, that the reliability standards are met, but also central scenarios without capacity mechanisms throughout Europe, where the application of an economic viability assessment will assess whether or not reported capacities by the TSOs are considered viable in the market or not, and if not, can be mothballed or taken out of service. So basically, these assumptions on capacity mechanisms, they are of course also collected, but they will be used in a later stage of the analysis to create different scenarios with and without these capacity mechanisms, and also give an idea of the impact of this on the results. I think there's some more questions. I don't know if one of my colleagues.
Yes, thanks, Christoph. I think we can continue with the insights on the preliminary data. At the same time, we'll answer some questions in written, just to ensure that we have enough time to make the presentation, and then at the end we can take the remaining questions online. So at this point, I will give the floor to my colleague Gregorio Iotti. Gregorio is a member of the market study team of ERAA, and is involved in the whole process, and even more in the modeling part. So Gregorio, the floor is yours for the presentation. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Lazaros, for the kind introduction. So it's also to introduce a little bit myself, because I'm sure you know very well Lazaros and Christoph, but indeed I work for Austrian Power Grid, so the Austrian TSO, and as Lazaros mentioned, I'm supporting ENTSO-E in delivering the adequacy assessment since 2019 within this market study team, which is a group of TSO experts indeed supporting on several tasks. This year also I supported on the data quality task force mentioned by Lazaros. So if we move to next slide, please. Yes, so before jumping into the visuals that I prepared for today, maybe it's good to focus on some key assumptions that will help you to understand and analyze the data yourself that will be published today. First of all, this is a call for evidence indeed on a preliminary data set. So basically what you will find are so let's call them raw data from TSOs that are collected indeed, as mentioned before, according to national energy and climate plans, and also in cooperation with member states and other stakeholders, but are still preliminary data, so they might be subject to updates or changes, maybe also thanks to your contribution after this call for evidence. A second important point, Christoph also was explaining how the EVA assessment also comes into place. But it's important to keep in mind that these data are somehow the raw data prior to the economic viability assessment. So this just somehow presents the starting point to build up on the additional assessments. Moreover, you will see that the data are available for 4 key pivotal years, which are the ones considered in ERA 2022. So 2024, 2025, 2027, and 2030. A couple of more, let's say, technical details. So the installed capacities reported are prior to unit or technology specific derating. So you can take them more or less as the nominal installed capacity of generation assets. And some more specifics on some flexible resources like electrolyzers, batteries, and DSR are reported in this data set, including only explicit capacity on the market. So to make an example, for batteries, for instance, the capacity you will see reported is the one of grid scale batteries, whereas household batteries are not included in this data release. Yes, and before moving to the visual, indeed, a quick overview on all of them. So I will start presenting what is basically the capacity evolution of the different resources over the horizon 2024-2030. Then some more in details on specific technologies. And also very interesting, a comparison with the pivotal years of ERA 2021. So I will compare the data of this new data collection with the one from ERA 2021. And also, as Lazaros already mentioned, a comparison for the target years 2025 and 2030 with the data coming from the so-called Fit for 55 mixed policy scenario, which is one of the core EU policy scenarios that can be used as a tool for the analysis and the impact assessment of the whole Fit for 55 policy package, but we will come to that later. And in the end, I will also give a brief overview on the average annual levels or values for the aggregated electricity demand. Next slide, please. So let's start indeed with the overall picture. So this is the generation mix in the 4 pivotal years, and are here reported all the different generation capacity. Very important, these charts report the aggregated capacity over the EU 27 plus 10 perimeter. So basically are all the countries that we explicitly model in our ERA assessments. And they are here aggregated per key fuel type, as well as hydro. It's presented in the usual 5 categories that if you are familiar with ENTSO-E studies, you would recognize them, but maybe it's worth mentioning them. We have 2 categories for pumped storage, so closed loop and open loop. And then we have the traditional reservoir, the run-of-river, and the pondage plants. Don't worry if this chart looks very dense, but here just all the technologies are reported, but we will focus later on specific subsets of them. So it will be more clear also to see how is the development and evolution of each of them. But to start giving some overall insights, as you can see, there is a steady increase of generation capacity basically over the whole pivotal years. It's really easy to notice also how renewables increase their share tremendously up to 2030, when they will represent more than 50% of the installed capacity. Keep in mind, again, this is not derated capacity, this is installed capacity. Another comment here, it's not really visible in this chart, but it will be more in the future ones. There is a considerable growth also of flexible resources, namely electrolyzers, batteries, and DSR. And this is very important also next to the integration of renewable energy sources. We can then move to next slides because I think it will be more clear to focus on specific subsets. So here you have a focus on the thermal capacity divided by fuel type. As you see, the thermal capacity stays almost constant up to 2027, while facing a faster decreasing capacity moving to 2030. What you can see, it's also specifically that nuclear capacity more or less also stays constant around 100 gigawatt of installed capacity. This does not come as a surprise because, as you probably know, there are indeed some phase-out policies in some of the member states, for instance, Belgium and Germany over the horizon, but there are also new units coming available, so that's why the capacity stays more or less constant. Also interesting to notice is a little bit of a full shift from gas technologies, replacing part of the coal and lignite capacity as well. Next slide, please. Now focusing on hydro, here is reported also the brackets values are somehow negative values, and it's reported there the pumping capacities of closed loop and open loop plants. In general, what you can see, interesting to notice that there is also quite some development of hydropower resources with a minor linear increase over the horizon. Whereas if you check the storage size that is reported on the right side of the slide, you will see that nevertheless the overall storage size stays more or less constant. That is because, of course, the hydropower potential in Europe has already mostly been exploited fully. So the reservoir size especially stays almost constant, but that means that there is more capacity basically empowering the existing reservoirs as well. Yes, I think that's all for hydro. I'm going very fast, sorry, so maybe I will slow down a little bit, but if there are questions, then I can answer also later. So next slide, we move to a focus on renewable energy sources. Here, very interesting, you see indeed almost exponential growth of renewables over the horizon, with almost double the total renewable energy installed capacity from 2024 to 2030. As you see, the highest growth is driven by solar PV and also onshore wind energy. It's also interesting how indeed the additional capacity installed increased tremendously over in the last 3 years of the horizon, when we see an increase of 200 gigawatt over the whole perimeter between 2027 and 2030. Yes, and I think we can move now to focus on flexibility resources, which is also quite interesting. What you see here is also indeed an exponential trend, with even triple the capacity in 2030 with respect to 2024 expected values. The key drivers here are the development of batteries, grid-scale batteries, as well as electrolyzers, whereas it's important to mention that this is the first ERAA edition where electrolyzer were included in the input data. And in the next webinar, there will be given some more details on how they will also be included in the model. But for now, for us, it's interesting to notice that indeed quite some consistent electrolyzer capacity coming into the market. As well as demand side response also faces an interesting growth, but rather with a linear piece than an exponential one. Also a quick comment on the battery sides that you can find on the right side of the slide as well. As you see, basically the battery size evolution follows a little bit what is the evolution of the actual, let's call it grid in-feed capabilities. So we have also an exponential growth up to around 120 gigawatt hour of battery sites planned or expected actually for 2030. Now moving to the next slide. Here now a little bit more into details about specific technology and how they change over the horizon. So basically what you can see in the chart are all the categories that were also available in the very first visual that I showed to you. Again, the values in brackets are negative values, which means that, for instance, if you have negative values, it means that the installed capacity available in 2030 will be lower than the one in 2024, whereas when you see positive bars on the right side, for instance, it means that there is higher capacity available in 2030 compared to the levels of 2024. Yeah, in general, interesting to notice here, again, the highest contribution in terms of additional available generation capacity comes from renewable energy sources. Tremendously by solar PV, so around 200 more gigawatt available, but also around 100 gigawatt of wind onshore, 75 gigawatt of wind offshore. You can also see in the lower part of the charts quite like some decrease indeed in terms of thermal installed capacity. And also interesting to notice in the pink and the dark orange parts, the growth in flexible resources, indeed, so electrolyzers and grid scale batteries. And at the bottom, at the top, sorry, you see around of 17 additional gigawatt of explicit DSR also available in the market. Yeah, the hydro stays more or less constant. And then moving to the next, yeah, sorry, I mean, fine. Then moving to the next slide. This is indeed, as I mentioned at the beginning, a comparison with the raw TSO data collected last year, so for ERA 2021. So as you probably remember, last year we only had two pivotal years included in the assessment, namely 2025 and 2030. So I will also present you the comparison for these 2 years. Again, it's the same type of chart. So when you see a positive bar, it means that more capacity is expected according to the TSO data in 2025, according to the new data collection for ERA 2022, compared to last year data collection. Whereas if you see negative values in brackets, it means that indeed the TSO data suggests that less capacity shall be expected for the 2025 horizon for this data collection compared to the previous one. Interesting to note is that in general, the total capacity in 2025 will be higher compared to the one collected for ERA 2021. And again, a reminder here, these are raw values prior to the economic viability assessment, which may change quite considerably this overview. So these are just the TSO data. The main contributors for this difference are, again, solar photovoltaic, where we see around 40 gigawatt more compared to the data delivered for ERA 2021. The same, also interesting to see higher gas capacity, so around 25 gigawatts. But if you check the data a bit more in details, you will see that this capacity is at the same time offset but by a lower availability of solid fossil fuels, so coal, lignite, and also other non-RES. So other non-RES, it's a category which aggregates normally fossil fuel fired small units, for instance, small CHPs or industrial units for cogeneration. Yes, that's it for the 2025 comparison. We can also compare now the data for 2030 in the next slide. Here you see similar trends. Basically, again, the total capacity expected in 2030 will be higher than the one expected for the previous data collection for 2021. Again, we see a higher expected capacity of solar photovoltaics, but as well as around 25 more gigawatt of wind split between onshore and offshore. Interesting to see also the development in hydro resources. Also the same trend also seen for gas capacity, which is nevertheless again almost completely offset by lower availability of solid fossil fuels, this other non-res category. And we also see a little bit less nuclear expected, so around 4 gigawatt less compared to the data collected last year. A very important disclaimer that I forgot to mention here is that, as I mentioned when presenting the visuals for the flexible resources, ERA 2022 is the first ERA edition including data for electrolyzers, meaning that from this comparison between ERA 2022 and ERA 2021 data, the electrolyzer capacity is excluded from these charts, as you may have noticed. Now, also another interesting comparison that we can present to you is the one, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, the one with the Fit for 55 mix policy scenario. So in the next slide, please. Yes, so again, the Fit for 55 mix scenario is one of the core EU policy scenarios which can be used, and that's what we did here as a policy scenario, as a tool for analysis across the impact of the Fit for 55 package. But this is again, these data are again an outcome of a modeling assessment using integrated assessment models or other tools. So these are not data coming from officially from member states or official plans. This is just a benchmark tool, and here we compare it indeed with the data we collected from TSOs for this ERA 2022 data collection. As you may have noticed already, the categories this generation capacity are aggregated into are quite different from the previous ones, from the ones I showed in my previous visuals. Why? Because these are the way we were able to retrieve the data from this Fit for 55 mixed scenario. So what we did here is to aggregate also our installed capacities in a way that is as much as possible compatible with the same categories. But as you see, for instance, we miss insight on batteries, DSR, and electrolyzer because it was not possible to retrieve raw data for that from the Fit for 55 scenario. Another disclaimer, so far, as I mentioned, all the data that I presented were aggregated over the whole, let's call it ERA perimeter, explicitly modeled perimeter, so 27 EU countries plus 10 additional countries in the ENTSO-E network. Whereas for this specific comparison, since the Fit for 55, it's a package of measures for European countries, so these data are aggregated only for the 27 European member states. Okay, what can we see here? In general, we see in the TSO data in total lower capacity for the target year 2025 compared to what we see in the Fit for 55 mixed data. The key drivers for these differences are, as you can see, mostly wind onshore and other non-res, which in this case were aggregated with biofuels. So again, we see these differences in biofuels, other non-res, as well as, sorry, other res, not other non-res, my bad. As well as we see in our assessment, sorry, in our data, a lower capacity available for lignite and coal. Again, what we see also here, it's a little bit of increased hydro capacity from the data delivered by the TSOs, and a little bit more of solar PV and thermal. Now, solar PV, yes. Next slide, please. Then we have a look also at the pivotal year 2030. 2030, of course, is the target year for which the Fit for 55 climate targets are actually expected to be achieved. So this is maybe even more interesting to analyze. We see similar trends from the one that I depicted in the previous slide. So here we see still that the total capacity in 2030, according to TSO's data, it's slightly lower compared to the one delivered by the Fit for 55 mix policy scenario. Again, the key drivers are a lower expected capacity for wind onshore, as well as other RES and biofuels. Whereas we see also lower thermal capacity, so lignite, solid fossil fuel, lignite coals, and a little bit of nuclear as well, which is nevertheless also offset by this other non-RES capacity that we do have in our assessment. Again, around a little bit more of solar PV in our aggregated figures, so around 10 gigawatt more, and around 30 gigawatt more of reservoir hydro. Before now moving to the analysis of the aggregated demand value, I wanted to stress again that these are preliminary data package, so there might be subject to changes. And also, indeed, we will appreciate your evidences in for specific member states. These were only aggregated values over the whole perimeter, but you will find country-specific values in the published data set that you can, of course, analyze and investigate. Okay, thanks, Lazarus. Next slide, please. Yes, moving to the little bit an overview on the evolution of the aggregated annual demand for the 4 pivotal years. Important disclaimer here, as Lazarus mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, also the demand forecasts are somehow internally computed by ENTSO-E using a specific demand forecasting tool, and they are then delivered for 35 different climate scenarios. At least for ERA 2022, before we maybe move to future approaches. And at the moment, the values that you see here are the average ones out of these 35 climate scenarios. But if I'm not wrong, all the different climate scenarios demand forecasts are published in the data set. What we can see in terms comparing these average and max values, it's pretty clear a steady increase of the demand over the whole horizon. And we can see similar trends for both the average demand and the peak demand. So, by the way, these are, of course, annual demand, so means the demand over the whole year. That's why you see these high values expressed in terawatt hours. What are the key drivers for this demand increase? Of course, the key ones are the electrification of the transportation sector, so electric vehicles, as well as electricity use in heating, so for heat pumps. We also have a great increase of data centers, which are also very energy intense, and this increase in electrification of the system is only partially compensated by increased efficiency. So that's why at the end the overall demand increases over the years. Moving to the next slide. Now again, also for the demand, annual demand, we can compare the values forecasted for ERA 2022 with the one used for ERA 2021 for the 2 pivotal years of 2025 and 2030. As you can see, on average, there are higher demand projections for both of these pivotal years. We see that higher values are provided especially by Central Western European countries. Again, the drivers are the similar ones I described before. So electrifications of the transportation sector, of the building sector, as well as, in general, a steady growth of the demand for electricity. Also, the same comparison can be done in the next slide with the Fit for 55 mix policy scenario. once again, in this case, the values for demand are aggregated only for the 27 member states of the EU. But the trends are fairly similar. We do see that compared to the Fit for 55 mixed data, we do see a higher average demand, at least as an average out of these 35 climate conditions. Yes, and this is it, I think, from my side. I know I've been very fast, but my intention was also to leave some space for specific questions in case you have.
Thanks a lot, Gregorio. No, I think it was very good. We received a lot of questions focusing on the methodology actually. So for these questions, I would advise the people to connect also to our next webinar on the 17th of March, which will be focused more on topics like this. I don't see, in the same time while Gregorio was making the presentation, me and my colleagues were also answering questions in the chat. So I don't see any open question with respect to the graphs for the moment. And I think we can move on then with the next slides. And Gregorio, you can also have a look at the questions in the chat in case there's something.
Yes.
So moving to the conclusion and the next steps. So as we mentioned, this is the moment that we launch this call for evidence. Just after this webinar, we will publish on our website the consultation page when you can read a short overview of this call, and then you will find also the link to provide your feedback, to respond to the online survey. But at the bottom of this consultation page, you will also find the different links directing to each of the data packets that we are consulting today. So mentioned in the slide with the data structure, you can see the different packages here. We have demand, we have the pan-European market modeling database, the net transfer capacities, climate data, and then the critical network elements and contingencies for the flow-based assessment. So we will also, of course, upload the presentation of today's webinar on our website, and there you can also find the links to these to the page for the call for evidence and the data. Now, closing the webinar with a short timeline of the next events. So today we are 9th of March. We have this call for evidence window opening, and it will last till the 5th of April. As mentioned already, a very important workshop we already planned to have on the 17th of March, and we invite you to join, since I also see a lot of questions focused on the EVA and the methodological details. You can have answers on that workshop, and you can also interact with our modelers that will be presenting. Moving then to the next event, we are planning to have also a webinar in May on methodological insights. This will come at a time that all the methodological decisions will be taken, and we can have a webinar on those for ERA 2022. The exact date is not yet fixed, but we will, of course, communicate this in due time. And of course, leading towards the end of the process, we'll have the ERA publication in November, followed by a webinar on the ERA results, on the ERA 22 results, and the launching of the final public consultation. We still have 5 minutes. I don't know if there are any other questions that we can take online.
Yes, Lazarus, I think there are at least 2 more questions that we could answer. One is on the data itself, if the main differences between 2022-2021 will be highlighted for each member state or only in an aggregated form?
Yeah, so you will not find slides per country or graphs per country, but we do have the data per country and per zone actually for you to consult.
Okay, so the per country data is part of the.
It's part of the data package, and also what Gregorio mentioned, I confirmed that we have the demand data per climate year. So we have all the 35 scenarios published.
Yeah, and then also a question on the license of the preliminary and final data sets. There, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but all the data which we publish indeed on the website can be used freely and is non-confidential.
Yeah, I think with just a reference, this data can be used. Okay, so I think at this point we can close the webinar. So I would like to thank all of you for joining this call, and we are really looking forward for your feedback in this call for evidence. And of course, a big thanks to the speakers, Christoph and Gregorio, for this for their support and their presentations. Thank you all, and have a nice day.